welcome to Hope Possible Ministries. Let's go ahead and check to make sure everything is going well. Let's see, am I streaming? Okay, let's look here. Let's take a look. Appreciate your patience. I'm my own tech team. Okay, so looks like we're streaming something. Gotcha. All right. So, even though it doesn't look like we're streaming on there, maybe I just have to reset it here. Aha, that's what it was. Just had to reset it. Okay, so I can see that something's happening. All right, great. Sometimes I really wish I had a technical support team, but that's just not the way it works around here. Okay, so today we're going to talk about something that you wouldn't typically think that I would want to talk about, right? We're going to talk about when to disobey. When to disobey, right? So, a while back, if you've seen it, if you haven't seen it, I really exhort you to take some time after this video to go see it. And it is a teaching I did about persecution. And it's called Persecution Vice. You can find it on my YouTube channel, Alan Bays. And I just want to point you to that for the reason that we know that we look around at what's happening, currently happening, what's been happening with all the COVID-19 and all the riots and all the things that are going on, and who knows what's going to happen next. We are living in very uncertain times. I believe that we're actually living in a time of transition. Now, what that transition means and what that transition ends up looking like, we'll find out. We'll see. But I do believe that we are, as a nation, even as the world, globally, we're in a time of transition. Because it's easy to get narrow focus on what's happening in this country and not to actually see what's happening in other countries. And we might not get the news about what's happening in other countries. It might not be so easily shared, but I digress. Okay, so we're in uncertain times. There's a lot of things going on. And we need to be prepared. As Christians, we need to be ready for whatever might come. So we must understand how persecution works, what persecution is and what it is not, and how to try to deal with persecution in the proper way. And this is actually a topic of similarity. Okay, it's not necessarily about persecution, but it is very integral whenever you see that the changing of our times. We need to know where we stand. We need to know what is a righteous cause and what is not. And there's a lot of causes going around right now, and it can be easily misunderstood what a righteous cause actually is. A sinner might think they have a righteous cause, but as long as they're continuing to be a sinner, whatever cause they have is not going to be consistent, and it's not going to be actual righteous, or it's not going to be justice for all. It's not going to be equal across the board. And that's just something that you could continue to see with any sinner with their righteous cause. So there's a lot of causes going around. We need to know where we stand on specifically this topic. And it's very relevant, it's a very timely message, and we really need to have a strong grasp of it. So anybody can make their cause seem right? I can go out there and start a cause and talk about all kinds of injustice and talk about some inequality and get people stirred up in their emotions, and I can seem like I have a just cause. But as Christians, we don't just follow something that seems right. We need to make sure that it actually is right before we do anything like that. So that's what we're talking about. And one thing you have to understand from the biblical perspective, getting all worked up in your emotions, getting all worked up in your principles and your offenses, and I have the right to do this and I have the right to do that, right? And all of that leading to the wrath of man, right? Well, the Bible has something to say about that. James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. So, being swift to hear means we need to consider the weight of the matter. We need to consider the consequences. To look down that road and to see where does that road lead before we act. So that's what it means to be slow to speak, slow to respond, right? Slow to react, right? And we're swift to hear. We take in all the information, and then by the guidance of the Holy Spirit, we discern good judgment. To be prudent. I mean, that's what prudence means. To be prudent means to look ahead, see the consequences of those actions, and if they're not good consequences, pick a different course of action. The people that are impulsive, and they just want you to hurry up and make a decision, and let's just go do it because, trust me, it's right. That's not wise. That's not prudent. And in most cases, if not every case, it leads to destruction and disappointment. Okay? So we need to be more prudent. We need to be slow to wrath, slow to speak, slow to respond on these things. That whenever we respond rightly. Right? And, just because we get angry about something, just because we get all drummed up in our emotions, right? And then someone fools us into getting attached to some mob to go do something, and they go out destroying things, well, that's the wrath of man. And it doesn't matter how much you go out and destroy, it's never going to work the righteousness of God. It never will. It never has. It never will. So we just need to understand that. All this rioting in the streets, defying the authorities, destroying and victimizing others, none of this is righteous. Right? How is it righteous? Okay, say someone was unrighteously killed, unjustly killed, right? It is a horrendous crime. Does that mean you can go out and kill others in the same way? Does that make that righteous? Well, I'm killing this person unrighteously because this guy got killed unrighteous, and that just gives me free reign to go around and kill as many people as I want because I'm right. No, that doesn't make anything right. Actually, you become just as bad or worse as the person who killed that other person. Right? We talk about police officers and things like that, and how police officers will, certain police officers will go beyond their training. They'll go beyond what they're supposed to do, and they will use their force, their lethal force, in a wrong way, and they kill someone unjustly. Now, when you go out and you go destroy other people's businesses, and you go out and kill people, or if you're associated with a group of people that go out and kill people, then you're just as bad or worse than that officer was. You're worse. because there's more of you, and there's more destruction going around, and there's more victims. Instead of one victim, now you've got thousands of victims. That's not the righteousness of God. Okay? But that's what's happening. Everybody gets angry, worked up in their emotions, and they go out to do stupid things. They incite physical violence and sedition. You know, one of the undercurrents here that a lot of people are not even looking at is the fact that what's going on is it is a defiance of authority. A defiance of authority. That's what's the underpinning of all these riots that are going on. You know, they are defying authority. So in light of these current events, all the insanity that is happening, we really need to be ready for persecution. We also need to discern when to disobey. There's a time to discern the moment that we are to disobey, and then how we go about doing that. I know it sounds strange because as Christians, we are taught to obey, and we are brought into subjection and obedience, right? So how can we also be called to disobey? Well, let's just start in Romans 13. Romans 13, verses 1 through 4. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Okay? For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. You know, be a law-abiding citizen, right? A lot of these things that's been happening out there, a lot of these deaths that's been going on as a result of these riots, right, is because they're not being law-abiding citizens. They're going out and breaking the law. And these things are happening as a result of their breaking the law. But if you're a law-abiding citizen, you shall praise of the same, right? You're not looking for trouble. You're not looking to defy the authorities, right? Verse 4, for he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So we are called to obey the authorities. And the authorities are there because God put them there. This is in respect to governments, police, etc. And if you put yourself in a position to be openly defiant to the government, then you are actually in defiance with God himself. It said right there that you receive damnation. You receive condemnation when you do these things. You're openly defiant of the authorities that God had placed there. So the only authority that are given to governments of this, of the governments of this world, the only true authority that they have, the only lasting authority, the only effective authority that they have is the authority that God has given them. John 19, verses 10 through 11. Then saith Pilate unto him, Speaketh thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee, and have power to release thee? And Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. So the authority or governing power does not come from men. God grants the authority to the governments of this world. Let's look at Daniel chapter 2, verses 20 through 21. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding. He removeth kings, and he setteth up kings. Rulers, authorities, governments. Okay? Proverbs 21, verse 1. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, as the rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever he will. Right? So God can redirect where that river is going. In the heart of a king, heart of a ruler, heart of someone who's been set in a position of authority, true authority. There are a lot of false authorities out there, but history has told us time and time again, these false authorities, they don't last very long. They don't last very long. They rise up, they fall down. They rise up, they fall down. Right? So it is true that not all, right, not all who are given this authority will use it rightly. Right? Just because they're given authority from God doesn't mean that automatically in every single case that they're always going to use that authority rightly. They can misuse that authority. And we see many kings in the Bible that openly defied God. You know, 1 Samuel 8:10 says, And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king. So here, the Lord is speaking to the people because they were demanding a king. They wanted to be like the surrounding nations. They wanted to be like the Gentiles who had kings over them. They wanted a king. Now, they already had the God of the whole universe. The one true God with all power and might ruling them directly. And can you imagine what kind of an insult that would be? It's like, no, we don't want you. We want one of these men to be king. Can you imagine the amount of insult that is to God? So if you read this chapter, you'll see that God was not pleased with their request or demand, depending on how you want to look at it. He was not pleased at all. And God explained that their appointed king will take everything they have and put the whole people under cruel subjection. That's what he explains. And then we go down to verse 18, and he says this, And ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. He will say, with all this injustice that's going on in the world, with all this stuff that's going on, why doesn't God do something? Well, this is one reason why he's not doing something. We've chosen the circumstances that we're in, right? We've chosen it, right? And because, as far as Israel's concerned, they wanted kings whenever they had injustice as a result of their rulers. God doesn't want to hear anything about it. You never should have asked for it in the first place. Right? And now as Christians, we know the same thing. We know that there is the God of the universe who we have to lead us. And if we point to some man and say, no, I know God says he can do everything, but I'd rather go through this man instead. Not only is that a big insult and slap in the face to God, but this is what God will do. He will not hear you whenever you start crying out for mercy under the ruler that you've chosen instead of him. So you'd think that after this warning that they wouldn't want a king. This warning from God, and this is not just a warning. This wasn't just a warning. This was a prophecy, because God knew that even after this being told to them, God knew that they would still want a king anyway. Right? So this was an actual prophecy of what will happen. And it has happened. Time and time and time again it's happened. So God knew that there would be evil kings. God knew it. And everything has consequences. Human kings, in preference over God, had serious consequences, and it still does. And God did actually shorten the lives of certain evil kings. Some evil kings were actually allowed to live longer. I'd read through the kings and I'd see, well, I can understand why this king didn't live very long. He was evil. He did that which was evil in the sight of God. So he only had a few years of reign. That makes perfect sense. And this one didn't last very long. This one didn't last all that long. But what about this one? This one also did what was evil in the sight of God and reigned a very long time. That always used to puzzle me. I was usually like, well, why this evil king as opposed to that evil king? Right? And God has his purposes. God moves the heart of the king like the changing of the course of the river. So even though that they might be evil and they have nothing but evil intent towards God, God uses them for as long as he can use them. And then if he doesn't need them anymore, he removeth the kings. He'll set them up and he will remove them, right? Based on his overall purpose. So some allowed to live longer because God in some way is still using that evil king. But then if God comes to a point where he has no more use for that king, he'll remove that king and set up another. Right? And actually, this reverberates all through history, not just Jewish history, but all history. Some kings, they're like a flash in a pan. And people are like, wow, that guy was pretty bad. It's a good thing he didn't last very long. And then you got people who last a very long time and cause all kinds of damage, like Adolf Hitler. Look at all the damage he caused. Why was he allowed to live so long? Right? So I can't answer that question. All I can say is that God will remove rulers in his own time, having the overall picture. He sees everything. He sees where everything is going. Right? So he has all wisdom, and I trust in the Lord. So even when a kingdom or government is evil in themselves, we are still required to keep their laws. Even if those laws are oppressive in our lives. In this country, we are all conditioned in the American way. We are given certain rights under the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We are accustomed to having what we call civil freedom or civil liberty. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is from the Declaration of Independence, signed July 4th, 1776. So this is why our country celebrates July 4th every year, Independence Day, because of the Declaration of Independence. That's when it was signed into law. And even if all those rights all those rights which are guaranteed under our laws, even if all of those were to be destroyed, we are still called to be law-abiding citizens. As the laws of our country affords these rights, right? The law also provides means to lawfully protect those rights. So let me back up for a moment. I see that I need to explain that a little bit. Now, we're going to get into differences of laws we can obey and laws that we can't. We're going to get into that a little bit later. But say my right to own property was stripped away from me and I couldn't own any property. What if my right to earn an income to take care of my household were stripped away from me and I was slowly being starved to death? Right? What if all those rights were taken away? What if I wasn't allowed to go anywhere? And I was even made to be a prisoner in my own home? Right? What if that were to happen? Do I rise up? Do I revolt? Do I join the militia and go out and start a war against the government to fight for my rights in that way? No. They're not telling you to sin, you obey. No matter how hard it is, no matter how much hardship you have to endure, as long as they're not telling you to go directly against God, you obey everything they say, even if it goes against you yourself. Even if you have no way to have a place to live or take care of yourself or your family, and you're slowly wasting away, and they make such oppressive laws like that, there's such oppressive taxes or whatever you want to call it, you just do it. Even if you die doing it. Right? We're not called to rebel against the government on these grounds. Right? We're not called to rebel at all. And we'll get into that also. So if what we call our rights, right? If those are violated, right? The law that we have says that it is right to seek redress to protect those rights, and even call for punishment to those that violated the rights. That's all part of the law also. So none of this is rebellion. All of this is part of the laws we are subject to obey. So by using legal channels to protect our rights, we are actually abiding by the law. So if a governor or someone like this orders me or requires me to do something that goes against the law of the land and takes away the rights that the law of the land has afforded to me, I have legal redress to not only defend those rights, but also to punish the wrongdoer that tried to take those rights away from me. That's the current law of the land that we have in this country. Right? There are legal channels for protecting the rights that we are given. We're not just called to sit there and take it, right? And as the laws are written out, now if we lose that ability, then that's a whole different world, right? And right now it's just a world of imagination because it hasn't happened yet, right? So we cross that bridge when we get to it. But right now, we have legal redress, right, to protect the rights that we have. And if those legal rights are violated, we have redress to handle those things legally through legal channels. I mean, governors, they can be impeached. They can be removed from office. Okay? And then after impeachment, they can even be prosecuted and thrown in prison. Those things can happen depending on what was done. Right? Governors, mayors, we all know that you can impeach the president, right? That's possible to impeach the president. A lot of people say, well, what does that do? I mean, you can impeach the president, he's still the president, right? What does that do? Well, it just depends on what he was impeached for and how the process was carried out and whether or not it's enforced, right? So there's a lot of things that are involved, but my main point at this part is just to point out that we have legal redress, right? So if you're being violated in some way in this country, according to the current laws, you have redress to address that. And it's up to you to seek out that legal redress. It doesn't mean going out rioting the streets, breaking the laws, putting people in danger. You do not have legal redress to do any of those things. Right? There are legal channels that are available to all of us. So it's fairly simple. When I protect my legal rights, as a consequence, I am protecting everyone's legal rights. If my rights are violated without being corrected, then that works towards taking away everyone's legal rights. It goes both ways. If your rights are violated and you don't seek legal redress and you don't seek legal measures for that, and that goes unanswered, and it goes unanswered, and it goes unanswered, guess what? The law disappears. And now no one has those rights anymore. But if someone uses the legal channels, legal redress, to stand for their rights, and they set a legal precedent, then that benefits everyone. That's basically how it works. So the way this system is set up, it actually can be best for everyone as a whole. But you have to know the law and you have to operate within the law. Now, when is it righteous to disobey the law? Right? Let's go to Acts chapter 5. Verses 27 through 29. And when they had brought them, they set them before the council. And the high priest asked them, saying, Did not we straitly command you that ye should not teach in this name? And behold, ye have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, We ought to obey God rather than men. And then a little bit further down, verses 41 through 42. And they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. And daily in the temple and in every house they ceased not to teach and preach Jesus Christ. Okay, so you can read this all on some other time when you have time to read all of it. But I'm just reading the beginning and the end to give you a brief synopsis of what's going on. That even though the Sanhedrin actually had authority over the people in Israel, they actually had authority over the people given to them by God. And people don't like to think about this, but God actually gave authority to the Sanhedrin. They had authority from God. And the apostles were subject to them. And when they ordered them to never preach the gospel or mention the name of Jesus ever again, they did disobey. They disobeyed. They disobeyed that authority. Right? It is true that, or did they? Or did they disobey? Right? They disobeyed or did they? All right, so he said, it's better to obey God rather than men. Okay, hold on to that thought. And it is true they disobeyed the law these men were trying to lay upon them. That part's true. They disobeyed that. It's also true they were at the same time continuing in their obedience. The obedience to God. So how can this be? Is there some sort of contradiction? I mean, didn't we just read in Romans 13 that Christians are supposed to obey man's law? And since their authority comes from God, is this some sort of a paradox? Right? It's true that if you disobey man's law, since God gave them authority, you would by consequence be in disobedience to God. It is also true that even though God uses the governments of this world to maintain order and to defend moral behavior and to punish immoral behavior, there are still evil people which will be put into these positions of authority. And in spite of their evil schemes and goals, God can still move their hearts like changing the course of a river. But when these evil men require that you must sin against God, that is the moment you cannot obey them. Any requirement to sin does not come from authority given by God. It comes from a different source. So if you read Romans 13, you'll see that it's God makes them a terror to evil and not unto good works, not unto the good, but makes them a terror to the evil. That's the nature of the authority that God gives them. Right? If they become a terror unto the good, they are not operating under the authority God gave them. They are operating on a different authority. A different authority. Because God would never require anyone to sin. James 1:13. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. So anyone that tells you that you have to sin against God, and that's by God's authority, they're lying to you. That's not by God's authority. God would not even tempt you to sin, let alone order you to sin. So any so-called authority that comes along and says, sin against God, right? Then that's not God's authority that they were given. They are going outside of their authority. They're going outside of it. So even though we do refuse to sin, we must obey all their laws otherwise. If they order us to do something that does not necessarily require us to sin, we must do it. Even if it oppresses us, even if we must spend all of our money with taxes, even if they take away all of our property, even if they imprison us or our family members, we must abide by the laws of the land. And the only time we can refuse is when they require us to sin. So in short, we must obey everything they say as long as they don't order us to disobey God. And in many applications, this would be very difficult. Very difficult. But even though we do seem to have a favorable legal system in this country, right? We have somewhat favorable laws that can be used rightly. We seem to have rights under the laws of the land, right? I tell you that I have faced many situations when police or city lawyers or city officials would violate those rights. And it was up to me to enforce those rights. It was up to me to seek legal channels to redress those violations. It was up to me to do that. Now, did you know that Christianity doesn't have any borders? Did you know that? I mean, if you don't realize that, then you really need to really think about that. Christianity is global. Christianity is universal. I mean, it spans all existence, right? Because God is eternally existent. God is omnipresent, present everywhere. So everywhere God is present, which is everywhere, Christianity is relevant. It doesn't have no borders. There is Christianity in other countries that don't have the legal rights that we have. Right? Christians have been openly persecuted in the past, and they are still openly persecuted in many other nations today. So even if all our rights were taken away from us here in America, we are still required to obey everything. And the only exception is if they require us to sin. And trust me, there are a lot of oppressive things the government can do without requiring you to sin. There are a lot of things they can demand of you without requiring you to sin. And they're things that you're not going to like. But you're still required to obey, even unto death, as long as they don't require you to sin. So what should our disobedience look like? What should it look like? You know, when we disobey sinful commands, do we gather an army and revolt against the government? Do we riot in the streets? Do we start a revolution? No, God forbid. 2 Corinthians 10 verses 3 through 5. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. We do not war after the flesh. We do not join revolts. We do not cause revolutions. Right? That's not what we do. Romans 12, verse 19. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. It's not up to us to get them back, to make them pay. That's not the reason why we do these things. That's not the reason why we seek legal redress, is to show some kind of revenge on somebody. You know, that's just simply using the law at hand. If that wasn't available, we would just have to take it. We just have to deal with it. Right? If that wasn't available to me, then I would just have to say, well, I don't like it. I have to suffer through it. The Lord will give me strength. I'll just have to deal with it. But we do have legal redress under those situations currently. But we're not to seek vengeance. We're not to seek revenge. That belongs to the Lord. Sometimes you just have to suffer loss. You just have to suffer loss. Right? And God is the one who repays wickedness. God is the one who repays that. God is the one who delivers wrath. He's the one that executes vengeance, not us. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 3. Thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. Endure hardness. Right? If you've ever been a soldier in the military, you might have some inkling of an idea of what it is to endure hardness. Another example, if you grew up in poverty, I'm not talking about what people call poverty today. I'm talking about real starvation, okay? Really doing without. You know, really having barely anything to wear, struggling to have a place even to live. If you've really endured that, then you might know a little bit about how to endure hardness. Okay? So that's what I'm talking about. If you have to live under some evil regime, right, then you have to endure hardness. You have to know how to endure hardness. That's why this is so closely linked to the persecution teaching I did. Whenever we're enduring persecution, we have to know how to endure hardness as a good soldier of Christ. To not lash back out of revenge. To not lash back to try to seek our own protection. Or to fight for our own rights. Okay? But we endure hardness. We do everything that we're required. Right? As long as we don't have to sin. as long as we don't sin. Now let's look for a good example of this in Scripture. Now, here we like to sing a song. The song's by Dennis Jernigan. And let me kind of sing a little bit for you. I'll just give a joyful noise. How does that sound? It goes, Remember Daniel in the lion's den. He was there, for he would not bow to men. There's no doubt or denying God shut up the mouth of the lion when he heard his servant cry. The Lord is my strength. The Lord in his power is my strength, day by day and every hour. Right? You know that song? I probably didn't sing it very good, but I did my best. Right? So we know the story, right? High-ranking officials in the king's court were jealous of the king's favoring of Daniel above them. The king favored Daniel above all of them, and they got jealous of that. Right? So what they did is they fooled the king into passing a law where it was illegal to pray to any god except that they would only pray to the king himself for 30 days. Now I wonder, how many Christians today, after hearing about that law, would just say, no problem, I just won't pray for 30 days. I'll just wait till it's over. How many of us would take that route? How many of us would take the route of, 30 days? No problem. I can go 30 days without talking to my God. No big deal. Right? Just saying. I think that there are a lot of people who would take that route. But Daniel was a faithful man. It means he's full of faith. Right? And he would not put man's law above his devotion to God. And it's also good to look at the fact that Daniel was not a rebel. He wasn't sitting around and just waiting for a chance to oppose the king. He wasn't just sitting around like, I don't really pray every day anyway. I pray like maybe once or twice a week, or whenever I get around to it, I might pray to God and give him a little bit of my time. No, he faithfully prayed every day without fail. Without fail. Every day. And really, that's the only reason why this scheme of his enemies would actually work against him. Because they knew that he would not fail in his faithfulness and his devotion to his God. So they decided to use that against him. Would they be able to use that against us? Would they be able to use our devotion against God against you or against us? Or we would just chuck it all out the window and crumble under the pressure? It's a good question. And I have to answer the question just like everybody. I have to answer it too. If I had something like this come at me and I'd say, 30 days is not a long time. Would I take that route, or would I take the right route? It's like, no, I need to stay devoted to God and make God first in my life in all things. And this comes between me and God. I need to continue in my devotion. That's the right answer. Daniel gave the right answer. He gave the good example. But he didn't sit around and just wait for something like this to happen and say, I don't pray every day. Then, wow, there's this law. Now I'm going to pray every day. Now I'm going to do it because that's an unjust law, and I'm going to protest. I'm going to protest the king and his unrighteous law, and I'm going to pray now, even though otherwise I would not do it. No, he didn't do that. He already prayed every day. He already had this faithful devotion. Right? So he just continued doing what he had always done, to have faithful devotion to God. He wasn't doing anything new. He wasn't doing anything different. He simply continued doing what he has always done. He wasn't looking for an opportunity to be a rebel. So his enemy uses that to destroy him. At least that's what they thought. Right? So do we have any good disciplines? Do we have any good disciplines in our lives that outsiders, that sinners might try to use against us, knowing that we would be so faithful in our good discipline that it would actually work to our undoing in their eyes? That they could actually count on us to continue being faithful in these ways. Are there any disciplines like that in our lives today? So this is what Daniel had to say about the king afterward, right? After he had already been cast into the den of lions. Daniel 6, verses 20 and 21. And when he came to the den, he cried, this is the king, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? Well, the king actually cared about Daniel, right? Because he was fooled. He didn't want to have this happen to Daniel. And he knew how faithful Daniel was to his God. And that was, in the king's eyes, commendable and honorable. He says that, whom thou servest continually. Right? Was he able to deliver thee from the lions? And then Daniel said unto the king, Cursed be you, you foul old wicked king. I defy your authority. Oh, wait a second. Where did that come from? It didn't come from the Bible. This is what the Bible says. And then Daniel said unto the king, O king, live forever. Now, was that because him and the king had a relationship and they liked each other? No. It's because Daniel never stopped respecting the authority that the king had. He said that about every king that he served. While as long as they were doing right and doing good things, he was saying, "O king, live forever." The only one he had really a lot of bad things to say about was the final king of Babylon before they fell. But he was just relating the consequences of that king's sin of what he did. But I digress. The attitude of Daniel against the king that had him thrown into the den of lions was, King, O king, live forever. No rebellion. You know. He wasn't a political activist. He wasn't against the kingdom. And keep in mind, I mean, he was in Babylon as a prisoner. And yeah, he was high in the courts and all that stuff. And God gave him favor and stuff. But he was still a slave in a big sense. He was still being held in captivity. He wasn't allowed to go back to the land of his people, as he very much desired to do. He wasn't in the circumstance that he would want for himself and his people. But he continued to have respect and honor for the authority that was given to those kings. And he showed it time and time and time again. So Daniel did know about the decree. If you read the whole passage, you'll see that he knew about the decree. And he didn't start a new practice of praying just so that he can defy the king's new law. Daniel already had a devotion to praying to God. And he simply continued in his devotion to God. Also, Daniel had nothing scornful to say to the king. Even after the king, even having to spend all night with the hungry lions, Daniel obeyed all the king's laws and was even more devoted to the king than any other high-ranking official, as long as they didn't pass any laws that required him to cease in his devotion to God or to sin against God. So there's plenty of things the kingdom can do and still not violate your devotion to God or to make you sin against God. So Daniel had a heart of obedience, and he had a heart of respecting and honoring authority. That's the pattern we see in Daniel. Now, God's authority is obviously higher than any authority a man might try to impose. You just need to know that. God's authority is always higher than man's authority. Now, coming from the military, it's really kind of easy for me to comprehend this idea. Someone with a higher rank than me gives me an order, I'm required to obey. I was a corporal, so if a staff sergeant gave me an order, I was required to obey that order. Now, if an officer who is a higher rank than that staff sergeant gives me an order that's contrary or goes against the order that the staff sergeant gave me, right? I'm required to obey that higher authority. It's the rank structure, right? That's how it works. Now, people can sit there and argue about certain things, but basically that's how it works. So the idea is that the higher authority supersedes the lower authority. Right now, obviously there's communication going on. And it did happen, by the way. There were times that I was given an order by a staff sergeant, maybe even a first sergeant, which is pretty high, or maybe even the sergeant major, right? And I'm given and that's as high as you can get in the enlisted ranks. And you get an order like that, and then you get a contrary order from an officer. And that has happened to me, right? In that case, I did what the officer told me to do. But there was communication going on. I would actually contact the lower authority and let them know that I've been ordered by this person to carry this out instead. And then how that got balanced out was above my pay grade, okay? They all worked that out within their authority structure, right? But then I would let them know that I know you told me to do this, but Captain so-and-so told me to do this instead. So you could talk to Captain so-and-so about it, right? And then they go through the chain of command, they work it out. So that's how it works. Higher authority supersedes lower authority, right? So this is really the only thing that Daniel did, which is also what the apostles did. They continued to obey the highest authority. So it wasn't rebellion. It wasn't political activism. It wasn't standing for their rights and fighting against the evil powers. It wasn't any of that. It was just a continued obedience to the higher authority. So it was obedience. It was obedience. They were willing to obey the lower authority of man as long as it did not seek to go against the highest authority of God. And even though this does involve disobedience, it is disobedience of an unlawful authority. Like I pointed out before, it's not from God's authority, it's going outside of God's authority, which makes it an unlawful authority. Right? And the attitude of the heart is always fixed upon obedience, not rebellion, not political activism. We're not seeking for reasons to rebel and start revolutions and go rioting out the streets. We are seeking obedience, even if that obedience comes with suffering. And it's not about personal comfort and wishes or what we would like or what's favorable to us. It's not about any of that. It's about being subject to the right authority. And we do have liberty, right? It's not a liberty from tyranny or tyranny. It's not a liberty from tyranny, It's not a liberty from oppression. It is not a liberty to give us ease or personal comfort or to fulfill our wants. It is simply a liberty from sin, a liberty from this world. This is a liberty that this liberty from sin can exist under any tyrannical earthly government. No matter what the conditions are, no matter how harsh they are, right? No matter how bad it is, even if we had no personal rights given to us by the government at all, we still have liberty from sin. That's the liberty that we have. So even under threat of death and torture, we will always have liberty from sinning in Christ Jesus. Let's look at Hebrews 11. I believe it's always really important to look at this from time to time. Kind of helps to put things into perspective, I believe. Hebrews 11, verses 32 through 38. And I exhort you to read the whole chapter, of course. But we're just going to focus on this portion. 32 through 38. And what shall I say? What shall I more say? It says, and what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turning to flight the armies of the aliens. When women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance. Not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword, and wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains, and in the dens and caves of the earth. And because they were devoted to God, they had liberty through all of this. Liberty from sin. Liberty to be devoted to God and to follow His will, no matter what the circumstance is. That's the liberty that they had. That's the liberty that we have. All of this could happen to us. Even if this were to happen to you, even if you were to be stoned, means to have a bunch of people with big rocks in their hands, and they all throw rocks at you until you're dead. That's what being stoned means in biblical context. Or how about sawn in half? While you're still alive, you're being sawn in half. Tempted, slain with the sword, right? Wandering around destitute, afflicted, tormented, right? These things can happen to us, and we will still have liberty. But our liberty is liberty from sin. Right? Anything else is just a blessing. So I do want to say that I'm glad that I do live in this country. I am glad that we have the legal system that we have that gives us legal redress to correct violation of rights. And I have no problem using that system that's available because that is the law that I am subject to in this land. If I was in another land, I'd have another set of laws. And if I had no legal redress or no rights afforded to me by the government, well, then I would just have to suffer it. And just because I do have legal redress doesn't mean that I seek that legal redress every single time. There's been times I haven't sought it. I pray about it. I decide what the Lord wants me to do in that case. But I'm glad I live in this country. I'm glad that I do have a level of freedom and rights that are granted under the current government that I'm under. That it's not, totalitarian tyranny. A lot of people like to say it is, but it really isn't. It really isn't. I'm able to stand here. I'm able to be here in this country. I'm having freedom to make this broadcast presently, right? And I'm glad for these things, right? I'm glad for these things. But even if all these things were to disappear, we seek to obey God, the higher authority, right? We obey the lower authority even if it's to our detriment, as long as they don't call us to defy the higher authority, to come between our devotion to God, to order us to sin. And there's all kinds of debates on whether or not you should meet in a fellowship or not meet in a fellowship because of this viral infection. And I do believe in caring for our fellow neighbor as far as not wanting to spread an infection that could kill them. I understand that whole debate. But there are ways of solving that problem to where it still does not come between our devotion to God, that we can still meet as a fellowship. Right? And even if we were to go against all of those health precautions, right? And I've heard people on news channels that say that, well, we'll just pray. And then they say, well, that just doesn't work. That's what the medical professionals say. The medical professionals that say that we just get together and we just pray, that just doesn't work. Well, that's their faith, not mine. My faith says that it does work. It doesn't always have to work. It's not guaranteed. It's according to God's will. But surely it can work. I've seen it work. I've seen it in action. And I've even seen it where people have become sick and the Lord healed them. Right? Supernaturally. So, I said that's up to every individual fellowship to whether or not they try to adhere to medical restrictions or not. I mean, you can meet in your cars, you can do that. And if the police come and round you up, well, so be it. They round you up. And then you deal with the legal redress that's within the law after the fact. Right? And as long as that continues to be the law, we can continue to do that. And here in this state, it has been decided by the court that our governor was wrong to prevent churches from meeting. So now churches can meet, right? There are other states that are going through the same thing. And the Attorney General is going through looking at different governors that's made unconstitutional demands and unlawful demands, and they're going to prosecute those as they come across them. So there is a legal redress that is taking place. But even if none of that worked, right, we need to continue to be devoted to God, right? And we need to continue to obey God and not sin against God, right? And I don't even think it's wrong to say we're just going to meet together. And persecuted churches in other countries, they find different meeting places so that the authorities don't know where they're at. I see no problem with that. If that's what you have to do, then that's what you have to do to maintain your devotion to God and to not sin. If that's the case, that's the case. It doesn't matter if people on the outside don't understand it. This is a matter of conscience. It's a matter of continuing to follow Jesus or not. Okay, so there is definitely a time to disobey. But it's not done out of convenience. It's not done out of comfort. It's not done out of personal preference. It's only done out of obedience and devotion to God, or if they try to prevent that. And that's it. Everything else we have to obey whether we like it or not. So hopefully this is helpful. This is a issue that requires discernment. And we have to have courage to do things like what Daniel did. What Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what they did. What the apostles have done. And others have done that we see in the Bible. And there's even a church history that we can look to. Things that Christians have done. Right? And we have to have courage to stand for what actually is right. Not just what seems right. And don't get drawn in to some political cause that seems right, that stirs up the emotion, and ultimately is nothing more than the wrath of man. Because man's wrath does not work the righteousness of God. Doesn't matter how much you feel that it's right. It's only right if God says it's right. So hopefully this helps, and hopefully this increases our discernment. And as going forward, I hope this helps people to know that when they have to obey and when they have to disobey. And in that disobedience, it's not a attitude of rebellion. It's not of, I'm just waiting for some chance to make a good YouTube video and get a lot of views or whatever. You know. It's not, oh, here's my chance to look courageous in front of everybody. No. Just continue in your devotion to God. Continue in your obedience to God. You follow the higher authority in obedience. And then everything else will just happen as a consequence. Good or bad. And that's where we need to be. So that's all I have to share today. Okay.